They called it the greatest military mystery of the Pacific War. Across 17 strategic islands, elite Japanese garrisons simply vanished overnight. No battles, no retreats, no explanations. Fortress positions that had cost thousands of Allied lives to approach were found empty at dawn, their defenders gone like smoke on the wind. American intelligence was baffled. What could make Japan's most fanatical warriors abandon positions they had sworn to defend with their lives? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The answer lay buried in a single classified document, a secret order so controversial that it would remain hidden in Tokyo's archives for decades. An order that revealed the true genius behind Japan's final Pacific strategy and the man who dared to defy the samurai code itself to save what remained of an empire. This is the untold story of Operation Silent Guide, the shadow directive that changed the course of the Pacific War and the brilliant strategist who orchestrated the most audacious military deception in modern history. The morning mist hung heavy over Rabaul Harbor as Captain Kenji Nakamura stepped from the transport vessel onto the wooden pier. It was March 15, 1943, and the sprawling naval base buzzed with the desperate energy of a fortress under siege. American bombers had been pounding the installation for weeks, their silver wings appearing like deadly birds of prey against the tropical sky each dawn. Nakamura carried himself with the precise bearing of a career officer, his uniform immaculate despite the humid air that seemed to wilt everything it touched. At 32, he possessed the lean build of a man who had spent years in the field, his face weathered by sun and salt spray from campaigns across the Pacific. What set him apart from the countless other officers streaming through Rabaul was not his appearance, but the sealed leather portfolio clutched in his left hand. Inside those pages lay orders that would reshape Japan's entire defensive strategy in the Pacific theater. The son of a rice merchant from Hiroshima, Nakamura had never intended to become a revolutionary military thinker. His path to this moment had been carved by necessity, tragedy, and an analytical mind that refused to accept conventional wisdom. While his contemporaries at the Imperial War College memorized ancient samurai texts and studied the glorious charges of the Russo-Japanese War, Nakamura had quietly absorbed the lessons of more recent conflicts. He studied Rommel's desert campaigns, analyzed the German retreat from Moscow, and most importantly, he understood something that few Japanese officers dared to acknowledge. The tide of war was turning against the empire. The revelation had come to him 6 months earlier, during the evacuation of Guadalcanal. Nakamura had been stationed there as an intelligence liaison, tasked with coordinating the withdrawal of Japanese forces from Henderson Field. What he witnessed in those final weeks haunted him. Thousands of Japan's finest soldiers, weakened by disease and starvation, had fought with desperate courage against overwhelming odds. They died magnificently, as Bushido demanded, but they died uselessly. Their sacrifice bought nothing but time for the Americans to consolidate their grip on the Solomon Islands. Standing on the beach as the last transport departed, watching American fighters strafe the abandoned positions, Nakamura had experienced an epiphany that bordered on heresy. The traditional Japanese way of war, with its emphasis on death before dishonor and final charges against impossible odds, was bleeding the empire white. Every glorious last stand, every heroic sacrifice was one step closer to national annihilation. There had to be another way. His breakthrough came during the long voyage back to Tokyo, as he studied detailed reports from across the Pacific theater. The pattern was unmistakable. Japanese garrisons, cut off and outnumbered, were choosing death over retreat.
Predictable regularity. Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima in planning. Each fortress island became a tomb for its defenders, their bodies fertilizing coral atolls that would fall anyway. The Americans had learned to expect this. They planned for it, counted on it, even respected it. But what if Japan's enemies were wrong? What if the most fanatical military force in history suddenly began acting rationally? The idea was so audacious, so contrary to everything the Imperial Army represented, that Nakamura initially dismissed it as impossible. But as he refined the concept during months of careful analysis, he began to see its devastating potential. The Americans were winning the Pacific War through industrial superiority and tactical predictability. They knew that every Japanese position would be defended to the last man, allowing them to plan massive frontal assaults that ground down resistance through sheer firepower. But if Japanese forces could abandon their positions at precisely the right moment, if they could preserve their strength while forcing the enemy to waste resources attacking empty fortifications, the mathematics of attrition might shift in Japan's favor. The strategy required perfect timing, absolute secrecy, and most dangerously, a complete rejection of the Bushido code that defined Japanese military identity. Soldiers would have to retreat without fighting. Officers would have to abandon positions without orders. Entire garrisons would have to vanish into the jungle, preserving themselves for future battles rather than dying gloriously in hopeless stands. It was military heresy of the highest order, and Nakamura knew that proposing such a strategy openly would likely result in his immediate execution for cowardice. Instead, he had spent 8 months working through back channels, cultivating relationships with a small circle of progressive officers who shared his concerns about Japan's strategic situation. Admiral Yamamoto himself had expressed doubts about the nation's ability to sustain prolonged warfare against American industrial capacity. General Tojo's staff included several pragmatists who understood the mathematics of defeat. Most crucially, Nakamura had gained the ear of Colonel Masaki Ishikawa, a brilliant staff officer who possessed both the authority to implement radical strategies and the political connections to protect those who proposed them. The meeting that changed everything had taken place in a nondescript tea house in Tokyo's Shibuya district on a rainy February evening. Ishikawa, a thin man with prematurely gray hair and eyes like winter sky, had listened without interruption as Nakamura outlined his revolutionary concept. When the presentation ended, the colonel had sat in silence for nearly 10 minutes, methodically sipping his tea while considering the implications. "You are asking me to authorize the systematic abandonment of fortified positions," Ishikawa had finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You want our soldiers to run away instead of dying with honor. Do you understand what you are suggesting?" Nakamura had chosen his words carefully. "I am suggesting that we preserve Japan's finest soldiers for battles we can win, rather than wasting them in gestures that accomplish nothing except to satisfy our enemy's expectations. And if word of this strategy reaches the General Staff, if Emperor Hirohito learns that we are advocating retreat without combat, then we die as traitors," Nakamura had replied calmly. "But if we do nothing, we die as a nation." Ishikawa had stared into his teacup for another long moment before nodding slowly. "Prepare detailed operational plans. Identify suitable commanders. Draft the necessary orders. But understand this, Captain Nakamura. This conversation never happened. These plans do not exist. And if this strategy fails, if it brings dishonor to the Emperor's forces, you will take your own life before facing a court-martial."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Their criteria for the experiment. Each was a fortified island or coastal stronghold that the Americans would inevitably attack. Each was defended by elite troops capable of the discipline required for mass evacuation, and each was commanded by an officer who could be trusted with the most dangerous secret in the Imperial Army. The orders themselves were masterpieces of careful language.
Officially designated as Tactical Flexibility Protocols, they authorized local commanders to redeploy forces as circumstances dictate to maximize strategic advantage. Hidden within the bureaucratic phrases was permission to abandon positions without formal authorization, provided the evacuation could be disguised as a temporary tactical withdrawal. The genius lay in the wording. No direct order to retreat was ever given. Instead, commanders received broad discretionary authority that they could interpret as their judgment demanded. The selection of participating units had been equally crucial. Nakamura chose veteran formations that had already proven their loyalty and courage in previous campaigns. The 47th Infantry Regiment, survivors of the Bataan Peninsula fighting. The 23rd Naval Landing Force, heroes of the early Pacific conquests. The 156th Artillery Battalion, decorated veterans of the China campaigns. These were not units that could be accused of cowardice. Their service records spoke of sacrifice and honor. If such forces chose tactical withdrawal over suicidal defense, their decisions would carry moral authority that lesser units could never claim. The timeline was compressed by necessity. American intelligence was improving daily, and the window for implementing such a radical deception was rapidly closing. The first phase of Operation Silent Tide would begin on March 20, 1943, with the coordinated evacuation of 3 test positions in the Solomon Islands. If successful, the program would expand to cover the entire Pacific defense perimeter. If it failed, if even one garrison was caught in the act of withdrawal, the entire conspiracy would collapse under the weight of its own audacity. Now walking through the bustling streets of Rabaul, with the operational orders secured in his briefcase, Nakamura felt the weight of history pressing against his shoulders. In 5 days, the most disciplined military force in the world would begin acting in ways that contradicted everything it had stood for throughout its existence. Elite soldiers would run from battles they could win. Veteran officers would abandon fortresses their predecessors had died to defend. The entire strategic framework of Pacific warfare would shift overnight, and the Americans would wake up to discover that their most predictable enemy had suddenly become utterly unpredictable. The risks were enormous. Discovery would mean not only personal destruction, but the collapse of Japan's entire defensive strategy. Success, however, might buy the empire precious months to negotiate a favorable peace before American industrial supremacy made resistance impossible. It was a gamble that could save or damn an entire nation, and it rested on the ability of a handful of officers to abandon the warrior's code that had defined their identity since childhood. As Nakamura approached the headquarters complex where he would brief the first group of participating commanders, he allowed himself a moment of doubt. Was he a visionary strategist attempting to save his country through innovative thinking? Or was he simply a coward, dressing his fear in the language of tactical necessity? The question would haunt him through the coming months as Operation Silent Tide unfolded across the Pacific theater and changed the nature of warfare itself. The briefing room was a converted storage facility in the basement of Rabaul's naval headquarters, chosen for its isolation and the thick concrete walls that would prevent eavesdropping. 6 officers sat around a scarred wooden table, their faces illuminated by the harsh glare of electric bulbs suspended from the ceiling. Each man represented a different aspect of Japan's Pacific defense strategy. Colonel Hiroshi Sato
commanded the garrison at Bougainville, where American forces were already probing the outer defenses. Major Ichiro Yamada led the 23rd Naval Landing Force, positioned on Vela La Vela and the Central Solomons. Captain Toshiro Watanabe oversaw coastal artillery positions on Choiseul Island, while Lieutenant Commander Akira Suzuki managed seaplane operations from a hidden base on Kolombangara. The 6th man
was perhaps the most crucial to the operation's success. Sergeant Major Kenzo Fujita had served in the Imperial Army for 18 years, fighting in China, Malaya, and the Philippines. His weathered face bore scars from a dozen battles, and his chest carried ribbons that represented some of Japan's finest military traditions. If such a man could embrace the concept of strategic withdrawal, other veterans would follow his example. Nakamura began the briefing with a careful analysis of Japan's strategic position in the Pacific, outlining the industrial disparities and logistical challenges that made traditional defensive warfare increasingly untenable. The officers listened with growing unease as he described the mathematical inevitability of defeat if current tactical doctrines continued unchanged. When he reached the core of his proposal, the room fell into stunned silence. "What you are suggesting is desertion," Colonel Sato said finally, his voice tight with controlled anger. "You want us to abandon our posts like cowards, to run from the enemy without firing a shot?" "I want you to preserve your forces for battles that matter," Nakamura replied calmly. "The Americans expect us to die in place. They plan for it, prepare for it, count on it. Our predictability has become their greatest tactical advantage." Major Yamada leaned forward, his eyes narrowed. "And you believe that abandoning defensive positions will somehow improve our strategic situation?" "I believe that forcing the enemy to waste resources attacking empty fortifications while preserving our veteran troops for surprise counterattacks will fundamentally alter the mathematics of attrition." Nakamura opened his briefcase and withdrew a detailed analysis of American offensive capabilities. "Consider the resources committed to reducing each fortified position. Artillery bombardments that last for days, consuming thousands of tons of ammunition. Naval gunfire that diverts warships from other operations. Airstrikes that require massive fuel expenditures. All of this assumes that the target contains defenders worth destroying." Captain Watanabe studied the documents with growing interest. "You're proposing that we turn their strength against them, make them waste their superiority on phantom targets, while we concentrate our forces for decisive engagement?" "Exactly." Nakamura spread additional papers across the table, showing detailed maps of proposed evacuation routes and concealment sites. "But the deception must be perfect. American reconnaissance will be watching every position constantly. The withdrawal must appear to be a routine rotation or resupply mission. No equipment can be left behind that might indicate abandonment. The Americans must believe these positions remain fully defended until the moment their assault forces arrive." Lieutenant Commander Suzuki raised the question that haunted every man in the room. "What happens when Tokyo discovers what we have done? When the General Staff learns that we have abandoned fortified positions without orders?" The silence stretched for nearly a minute before Nakamura answered. "That depends entirely on whether the strategy succeeds. If Operation Silent Tide demonstrates its effectiveness, if we can preserve significant forces while forcing the Americans to waste resources on empty targets, then history will vindicate our decision. If it fails, if we are discovered, or if the tactical advantages fail to materialize, then we will face consequences that I need not describe." Sergeant Major Fujita spoke for the first time, his gravelly voice carrying the authority of decades in uniform. "I have watched too many good soldiers die in hopeless
Charges, Captain. I have seen entire companies eliminated because they refuse to retreat from untenable positions. If there is a way to preserve these men while still serving the Emperor, then I will follow your orders." The old soldier's endorsement broke the deadlock. One by one, the other officers voiced their agreement, though each struggled with the implications of what they were accepting. They were career military men, trained from childhood to value honor above life itself. The decision to abandon defensive positions without direct orders represented a fundamental betrayal of everything they had been taught to believe about duty and sacrifice. Nakamura spent the next 3 hours walking them through every detail of the operation.
Each commander would receive sealed orders specifying the exact timing and methodology for their withdrawal. Communication between participating units would be maintained through a network of coded radio transmissions that would appear to be routine administrative traffic. Most crucially, each garrison would leave behind carefully prepared evidence suggesting that defensive preparations were continuing normally right up until the moment of abandonment. The deception required meticulous attention to detail. Cooking fires would be maintained by skeleton crews until the last possible moment. Radio operators would continue broadcasting routine messages from abandoned command bunkers. Dummy positions would be constructed to simulate the presence of troops and equipment that had already been evacuated. The goal was to convince American intelligence that each target remained fully defended and prepared for prolonged resistance. The evacuation routes had been selected with equal care. Each garrison would withdraw along predetermined paths that offered maximum concealment from aerial reconnaissance. Hidden supply caches would sustain the evacuated forces during their movement to rally points deep in the interior of larger islands or in concealed bases on smaller atolls. From these positions, the preserved units would be available for rapid redeployment when tactical opportunities arose. As the briefing concluded, Nakamura distributed the operational orders to each commander. The documents were written in a complex code that would appear to be standard tactical instructions to casual inspection, but contained the precise details necessary for coordinated withdrawal. Each officer would be responsible for briefing his subordinate commanders using similar methods, creating a chain of understanding that left no written record of treasonous intent. Colonel Sato was the last to leave, pausing at the doorway to address Nakamura directly. "Captain, I want you to understand something. I am not agreeing to this plan because I believe retreat is honorable. I am agreeing because I believe the alternative is the destruction of everything we have sworn to protect. If you are wrong, if this strategy brings shame to the Emperor's forces, I will personally ensure that you face the consequences." "I understand completely, Colonel, and I accept full responsibility for whatever follows." The next 72 hours passed in a blur of final preparations. Each participating commander returned to his unit and began the delicate process of preparing his men for an operation that could not be fully explained until the moment of execution. Equipment was quietly redistributed to facilitate rapid movement. Ammunition and supplies were cached at predetermined locations. Most importantly, trusted subordinates were gradually introduced to the concept of tactical withdrawal under circumstances that made traditional defensive stands impossible. The psychological preparation was perhaps the most challenging aspect of the entire operation. Japanese soldiers had been conditioned since childhood to view retreat as the ultimate dishonor. The concept of preserving forces for future engagement rather than dying gloriously in hopeless battles required a fundamental shift in thinking that went against every instinct their training had developed. Success would depend on the ability of veteran officers to reframe the operation in terms that allowed their men to maintain their sense of honor while acting in ways that appeared dishonorable. Nakamura spent these final days in constant communication with his network of conspirators, monitoring American force movements and refining the timeline for the first phase of withdrawals. Intelligence reports indicated that Allied forces were indeed preparing major offensive operations against several of the targeted positions. The Americans were following their predictable pattern, massing overwhelming firepower for systematic reduction of Japanese strongholds. They expected fierce resistance and prolonged fighting. They were preparing to pay a high price in casualties and resources for victories that would prove to be hollow. The morning of March 20th dawned clear and still across the Solomon Islands. American reconnaissance aircraft began their routine patrols, photographing Japanese positions and documenting defensive preparations that appeared to be proceeding normally. Radio intercepts suggested that garrison commanders were making final preparations for prolonged siege warfare. Artillery positions were being reinforced, ammunition was being distributed to forward positions, Every indication suggested that Japan's forces were preparing to fight with their characteristic determination. What the Americans could not detect was the carefully orchestrated withdrawal that had begun before dawn. The first phase involved 3 positions that represented different tactical situations and geographic challenges. The garrison on Vella La Vella would test the concept on a small, isolated island where complete evacuation was possible. The defenders of Bougainville would attempt partial withdrawal while maintaining the appearance of full strength. The coastal artillery on Choiseul would execute a complete abandonment disguised as a routine rotation of personnel. Major Yamada stood in the abandoned command bunker on Vella La Vella as the last of his men disappeared into the jungle. Radio equipment continued to broadcast automated messages that would maintain the illusion of normal operations for another 12 hours. Cooking fires smoldered in empty camps tended by remote devices that would maintain them until fuel ran out. Dummy positions created shadows that would confuse aerial reconnaissance. To observers, the island appeared to be bristling with determined defenders, preparing for a final stand. In reality, 847 Japanese soldiers were moving silently through pre-planned routes toward evacuation points on the island's southern shore. They carried only essential equipment and enough supplies to sustain them during the movement to their rally point on a neighboring atoll. Heavy weapons and defensive installations were left behind, rigged with delayed charges that would create the impression of desperate fighting when American forces finally landed. The withdrawal from Bougainville presented greater challenges due to the size of the island and the complexity of the defensive network. Colonel Sato had chosen to evacuate roughly half his forces while maintaining skeleton crews at key positions that would be observed most closely by American intelligence. The evacuated troops would establish concealed camps in the island's interior, ready to emerge for surprise attacks against American supply lines once the invasion began. The coastal artillery withdrawal from Choiseul was perhaps the most audacious element of the entire operation. Captain Watanabe had convinced his superiors that the guns needed to be relocated to avoid American counter-battery fire, a routine precaution that provided perfect cover for complete evacuation. Transport vessels approached the island under cover of darkness, loaded the artillery pieces and their crews, and departed before dawn. Wooden decoys left in the original positions would fool aerial reconnaissance for several days. As reports filtered back to Nakamura through coded transmissions, it became clear that
First phase had succeeded beyond his most optimistic projections. All 3 evacuations had been completed without detection. American intelligence continued to report normal defensive activity at each position. The stage was set for the next phase of Operation Silent Tide, the expansion of tactical withdrawal to 17 positions across the Pacific Theater. But success in the first phase only intensified the risks for everyone involved. Each additional evacuation increased the chances of discovery. Each empty fortress waiting to be attacked represented another opportunity for American forces to realize that Japan's most predictable characteristic had suddenly vanished. The window of opportunity was narrow and closing rapidly. Within days, the entire Pacific War would begin shifting in ways that neither side could fully comprehend. The transformation had begun with a single heretical idea in the mind of a captain from Hiroshima. Now that idea was spreading across thousands of miles of ocean, carried by men who had chosen to risk everything on the possibility that survival might serve the emperor better than glorious death. Whether Operation Silent Tide would save the Japanese Empire or destroy it remained to be seen. But one thing was certain: the Pacific War would never be the same. The dawn of March 23rd brought with it the first test of Operation Silent Tide's true effectiveness. American forces launched their assault on Vella La Vella with devastating preliminary bombardment that lasted 6 hours. Naval guns pounded the island's defensive positions, while carrier-based aircraft dropped tons of ordnance on suspected strongholds. The barrage was so intense that it could be heard from islands 50 miles away, a thunder that rolled across the Pacific like the voice of industrial warfare itself.
When the first wave of Marines hit the beaches, they expected the fierce resistance that had characterized every previous Pacific landing. Instead, they found empty bunkers still warm from cooking fires, defensive positions abandoned so recently that personal items remained scattered on the ground. The discovery sent shockwaves through the American command structure. Intelligence officers scrambled to understand how an entire garrison could simply vanish without leaving any trace of their movement. Major General Robert Hawkins, commanding the assault force, stood on the beach 3 hours after the landing and stared at the abandoned Japanese positions with growing bewilderment. His forces had prepared for weeks of brutal fighting, bringing enough ammunition and medical supplies to sustain heavy casualties through prolonged combat. Instead, they had captured a ghost island defended by shadows and echoes. The mystery deepened as similar reports arrived from Choiseul and Bougainville. The coastal artillery positions that had threatened American shipping for months were revealed to be elaborate wooden decoys when ground forces finally reached them. On Bougainville, partial evacuations had created the illusion of normal defensive strength while actually removing the most effective combat units from positions where they would have been destroyed in futile last stands. Admiral Chester Nimitz received the consolidated reports in his Pearl Harbor headquarters with a mixture of frustration and grudging admiration. The Japanese military had been utterly predictable for 2 years of Pacific warfare. Their fanatical determination to defend every position to the last man had allowed American planners to calculate the cost of victory with mathematical precision. Now that predictability had shattered overnight, replaced by an enemy that seemed to have abandoned everything the empire had stood for since the Meiji Restoration. The implications were staggering. If Japanese forces could no longer be counted upon to die in place, if they had developed the tactical flexibility to preserve their strength through strategic withdrawal, then the entire American offensive strategy would need fundamental revision. Worse, the resources expended attacking empty positions represented a massive waste of
materiel that could have been used more effectively elsewhere. The industrial superiority that gave America its decisive advantage was being turned against itself through enemy deception. Intelligence analysts worked around the clock trying to understand the pattern behind the evacuations. Some theorized that communication breakdowns had led to unauthorized retreats by local commanders. Others suggested that Japan's deteriorating strategic position had forced a fundamental change in defensive doctrine. A few perceptive officers began to suspect that they were witnessing a coordinated deception operation of unprecedented scope and audacity. Captain Nakamura monitored these developments from his temporary headquarters in a concealed bunker on New Britain. The success of the first phase had exceeded every expectation, but it also created new dangers. American intelligence was adapting rapidly to the changed circumstances. Reconnaissance flights were becoming more frequent and thorough. Radio intercepts were being analyzed with greater sophistication. The window of opportunity for additional evacuations was closing with each passing day. More troubling were the reports filtering back from Tokyo. Word of the mysterious Japanese withdrawals had reached the Imperial General Staff, where it was generating intense debate about the reliability of field commanders. Investigations were being launched to determine whether the evacuations represented unauthorized retreats or a coordinated strategy. If the wrong conclusions were reached, everyone involved in Operation Silent Tide would face immediate execution for treason. Colonel Ishikawa arrived at Nakamura's bunker on March 28th, his face grim with the weight of information gathered during a hasty trip to the capital. The thin staff officer had spent 3 days navigating the treacherous currents of Tokyo politics, attempting to gauge official reaction to the Pacific developments without revealing his own involvement in their orchestration. The news was mixed, at best. Emperor Hirohito had personally expressed concern about reports of Japanese forces abandoning defensive positions without imperial authorization. General Tojo was demanding detailed explanations from Pacific commanders about their tactical decisions. Most dangerously,
The Kempeitai military police had begun investigating several officers whose units had participated in suspicious withdrawals. Yet there were also encouraging signs. Admiral Yamamoto had quietly praised the tactical innovation demonstrated in the Solomon Islands operations. Several progressive staff officers were arguing that Japan's changed circumstances required corresponding changes in military doctrine. Most significantly, preliminary analyses suggested that the preserved forces were indeed proving more effective in mobile operations than they would have been in static defense. The debate within Japan's military hierarchy reflected a deeper philosophical struggle about the nature of honor and sacrifice. Traditional elements argued that retreat under any circumstances represented unacceptable departure from Bushido principles that had defined Japanese military excellence for centuries. Progressive voices countered that blind adherence to outdated doctrines was leading the empire toward unnecessary destruction. The outcome of this internal conflict would determine whether Operation Silent Tide could continue or whether its architects would face swift retribution.
Need to approach defended islands without arousing American suspicion. Evacuation routes would need to accommodate thousands of soldiers moving simultaneously across terrain under constant enemy observation. Communication networks would need to coordinate the operation while maintaining the radio traffic patterns that convinced American intelligence that normal defensive preparations were continuing. Most challenging of all was the psychological dimension of the expanded operation. The initial evacuations had involved carefully selected units commanded by officers who understood the strategic rationale behind tactical withdrawal. Expanding the program to 17 positions would require the participation of commanders who had not been previously briefed on Operation Silent Tide's existence. These officers would need to be convinced to abandon their posts based on coded orders that could not explicitly authorize retreat. The solution came from an unexpected source. Sergeant Major Fujita had been working with trusted subordinates to develop a communication system that could convey complex tactical instructions through seemingly routine administrative messages. The code relied on subtle variations in standard military terminology that would be meaningless to casual observers, but carried precise operational guidance for those who understood the system. Orders for the second phase would be disguised as routine directives regarding defensive preparations and troop rotations. Local commanders would receive instructions to optimize tactical positioning for maximum operational flexibility and ensure rapid response capability for emerging strategic opportunities. Buried within this bureaucratic language were detailed specifications for evacuation timing, routes, and procedures. The genius of the system lay in its deniability. If challenged by superior officers, local commanders could claim they were simply following standard defensive protocols while adapting to local conditions. The orders contained no explicit authorization for retreat, but they provided enough guidance for experienced officers to execute coordinated withdrawals while maintaining plausible justification for their actions. Implementation began on April 2nd with the simultaneous dispatch of coded orders to 17 garrison commanders across the Pacific Theater. Each message was carefully crafted to account for local tactical conditions and American threat assessments. Islands under immediate attack pressure received priority timing for evacuation. Positions facing longer-term threat development were given extended preparation periods. The goal was to create a rolling pattern of withdrawals that would maximize confusion while preserving the maximum number of veteran troops. The response from field commanders varied dramatically. Some officers immediately grasped the implications of their coded instructions and began covert preparations for tactical withdrawal. Others struggled with the moral implications of abandoning defensive positions without explicit orders. A few refused entirely, declaring their intention to defend their positions according to traditional Bushido principles regardless of strategic considerations. Major Keisuke Tanaka commanded the garrison on Marcus Island, a strategic outpost that controlled approaches to the Japanese home islands. His initial response to the coded orders was one of outrage at what he perceived as cowardly suggestions from staff officers who had never faced enemy fire. Tanaka was a traditionalist who believed that Japanese military superiority stemmed from spiritual strength rather than tactical innovation. The idea of preserving his forces through retreat struck him as fundamentally dishonoring to the emperor and the warrior traditions that had made Japan great. It took a personal visit from Colonel Ishikawa to convince Tanaka that Operation Silent Tide represented genuine strategic thinking rather than defeatist propaganda. The staff officer spent 6 hours in private conference with the island commander, walking him through the mathematical realities of Japan's strategic position and the tactical advantages that could be gained through coordinated deception operations. By the end of their discussion, Tanaka had reluctantly agreed to participate, though his cooperation remained grudging at best. Similar scenes played out across the Pacific as the conspiracy expanded to encompass dozens of officers who had never been briefed on the operation's true scope. Each recruitment represented a massive security risk, but the strategy's effectiveness depended on achieving sufficient scale to fundamentally alter American tactical expectations. Half measures would alert enemy intelligence without providing corresponding strategic benefits. The evacuations began on April 8th, with the withdrawal of garrison forces from 3 atolls in the Marshall Islands. American intelligence had identified these positions as likely targets for upcoming offensive operations, making them perfect test cases for the expanded deception program. Each island presented different tactical challenges and evacuation opportunities, providing valuable data for refining the operational methodology. Wake Island's garrison executed perhaps the most audacious withdrawal of the entire operation. Commander Jiro Matsumoto had spent weeks preparing his men for an evacuation that would need to occur under the direct observation of American reconnaissance aircraft. The solution involved a carefully choreographed deception that made the withdrawal appear to be a reinforcement operation, bringing additional troops to strengthen the island's defenses. Transport vessels approached Wake under cover of darkness, ostensibly carrying supplies and replacement personnel. In reality, they were evacuating the entire garrison while leaving behind elaborate dummy installations designed to simulate continued defensive preparations. Radio operators maintained normal communication patterns from concealed positions until the last possible moment. The deception was so complete that American intelligence actually upgraded their assessment of Wake's defensive strength just as the last Japanese soldier was departing the island. The psychological impact on American planning was immediate and profound. Intelligence officers who had grown accustomed to predicting Japanese defensive behavior with mathematical precision suddenly found themselves operating in a fog of uncertainty. Islands that appeared heavily defended might be empty. Positions that seemed abandoned might conceal significant forces. The reliable enemy had become utterly unreliable, forcing comprehensive revision of operational planning that had been refined through 2 years of Pacific warfare. General Douglas MacArthur expressed his frustration with the changed circumstances during a staff meeting at his Australia headquarters. The Japanese military that his forces had been systematically defeating through superior firepower and industrial capacity had apparently learned to think strategically, rather than simply react emotionally to American pressure. This development threatened to extend the Pacific War by months or even years as Allied forces adapted to an enemy that no longer obliged them by fighting according to predictable patterns. The success of the Marshall Islands evacuations emboldened Nakamura to authorize the most ambitious phase of Operation Silent Tide. 12 additional positions would be evacuated simultaneously across a front stretching from the Carolines to the Marianas. The coordination required would strain the conspiracy's communication networks to their breaking point, but the potential strategic impact justified the enormous risks involved. Each evacuation presented unique challenges that required innovative solutions. The garrison on Truk Japan's supposedly impregnable fortress in the Caroline Islands would need to withdraw significant forces while maintaining the appearance of full defensive readiness. The defenders of Saipan and Guam would execute partial evacuations that preserved their most effective units while leaving skeleton forces to maintain
operational deception. Most daringly, the coastal defense forces throughout the Mariana Chain would coordinate simultaneous withdrawals designed to create maximum confusion about Japan's defensive intentions. The operation required perfect timing across thousands of miles of ocean. Weather patterns needed to be factored into evacuation schedules to ensure that transport vessels could approach defended islands without detection. American patrol schedules had to be analyzed to identify brief windows of opportunity when large-scale troop movements might go unobserved. Most critically, the evacuations needed to occur close enough together in time to prevent American intelligence from recognizing the pattern and alerting other targeted positions. Nakamura established his final command post on the heavily forested island in the Northern Carolines, from which he could coordinate the climactic phase of his revolutionary strategy. The bunker complex had been constructed using techniques learned from German advisors, featuring multiple levels connected by tunnels that could withstand even direct hits from the largest American bombs. Communication equipment included the most sophisticated radio sets available to the Japanese military, capable of maintaining contact with scattered units across the entire Pacific theater. The countdown to the final evacuations began on April 20th with the distribution of precise timing orders to all participating commanders. Each officer received detailed schedules specifying the exact hour when his withdrawal should commence, the routes to be followed during evacuation, and the deception measures to be maintained after departure. The margin for error was essentially zero. Any deviation from the planned timeline could expose the entire operation and doom everyone involved. Weather proved to be the most unpredictable factor in the complex equation. A typhoon developing east of the Philippines threatened to disrupt transport schedules throughout the Western Pacific. High seas would make evacuations from exposed positions extremely dangerous, while also providing cover from American aerial reconnaissance. Nakamura made the agonizing decision to proceed with the original schedule despite the meteorological risks, gambling that the storm would help rather than hinder the operation. The first evacuations began at precisely 0200 hours on April 23rd as transport vessels approached Truk under cover of darkness and driving rain. The fortress island had been the cornerstone of Japanese Pacific defenses, its harbors and airfields supporting operations across thousands of square miles of ocean. Now its garrison was slipping away into the night, carrying with them the accumulated expertise of 2 years of Pacific warfare. Admiral Kenzo Kobayashi commanded the Truk evacuation with the methodical precision that had made him one of Japan's most respected naval officers. His forces had spent weeks preparing for a withdrawal that would need to preserve not only personnel, but also critical equipment and supplies. The challenge was complicated by the need to maintain operational security while evacuating a complex that employed thousands of military and civilian personnel. The solution involved a carefully staged withdrawal that began with non-essential personnel and gradually expanded to encompass the entire garrison. Administrative staff departed first, ostensibly being transferred to other assignments. Technical specialists followed, carrying with them irreplaceable expertise in radar operation and aircraft maintenance. Finally, combat units began their exodus, moving in small groups that could avoid detection by American surveillance systems. Meanwhile, an elaborate deception program maintained the illusion that Truk remained fully operational. Radio traffic continued at normal levels, broadcast from concealed transmitters operated by skeleton crews. Aircraft movements were simulated using carefully timed engine tests that suggested normal flight operations. Harbor activities were maintained through the movement of empty vessels or activities designed to create impressions of large-scale movements of supplies and personnel.
That created the acoustic signatures associated with continued logistical operations. Similar scenes played out across the Marianas as garrisons that had prepared for months of siege warfare instead melted away into the tropical night. The defenders of Saipan, Guam, and Tinian executed coordinated withdrawals that preserved their most effective units while leaving behind elaborate deceptions designed to convince American intelligence that defensive preparations were actually intensifying rather than diminishing. The psychological pressure on participating commanders was enormous. These were career officers who had spent their lives preparing to defend Japanese territory with their blood. Now they were abandoning positions that previous generations had sworn to hold until death. The cognitive dissonance between training and action created stress that manifested in physical symptoms ranging from insomnia to digestive disorders. Captain Hiroshi Yamamoto, evacuating his coastal artillery regiment from Tinian, later described the experience as the most difficult decision of his military career. His guns commanded approaches to some of the most strategically important terrain in the Pacific, and abandoning them felt like betraying every principle he had been taught since entering the Imperial Military Academy. Only his absolute faith in Nakamura's strategic vision allowed him to order his men into the evacuation boats, rather than the gun pits where they had expected to make their final stand. The human cost of Operation Silent Tide extended beyond the officers who struggled with its moral implications. Thousands of Japanese soldiers found themselves participating in actions that contradicted their fundamental understanding of military honor. Many had joined the Imperial Army specifically because they believed in the warrior ideals that the operation seemed to repudiate. Preserving their fighting effectiveness for future battles required them to abandon positions they had been prepared to defend with their lives. The solution came through careful reframing of the operation's objectives. Rather than describing the withdrawals as retreats, participating officers emphasized the tactical advantages of preserving veteran forces for decisive future engagements. Instead of abandoning defensive positions, garrisons were conducting strategic redeployments that would maximize their effectiveness against American industrial superiority. The language mattered enormously to men whose identity was built around concepts of honor and sacrifice. As reports of successful evacuations filtered back to Nakamura's command bunker, it became clear that the final phase of Operation Silent Tide was exceeding even his most optimistic projections. 12 major defensive positions had been evacuated without detection, preserving over 15,000 veteran troops who would otherwise have been destroyed in futile defensive actions. The preserved forces represented an enormous strategic asset that could be deployed for surprise operations against American supply lines and newly captured positions. The American response to the mysterious Japanese withdrawals revealed the operation's profound impact on enemy strategic thinking. Intelligence assessments that had previously focused on calculating the defensive strength of individual positions now struggled to understand Japan's overall defensive strategy. Planning cycles that had been based on predictable enemy behavior were extended as staff officers attempted to account for unprecedented tactical flexibility.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.